Hey folks, welcome back for another build video where we're looking at the D50 and the Deflector Shield. So that is burying the lead just a little bit. We are obviously also working with the RIDGEWAY'S Pride exotic chest piece, and more accurately we are looking at pairing the Bleeding Edge talent with the Deflector Shield's ability to ricochet incoming bullets back at nearby enemies. Because one of the cool things about pairing these two talents is now whenever enemies within 15 meters shoot at you, they actually apply bleed to themselves. Now later on you'll see that in action, but let's get into this one. Starting with the specialization, we've gone with the Technician to get the +1 skill tier from the Amped talent. That'll help buff both our Riot Foam and our Deflector Shield's overall effectiveness. For our primary and secondary weapons, we have shotguns here, but ultimately you're not going to be using these very often, as the Deflector Shield only allows you to use your sidearm when it is equipped. But for those rare times when you don't have your Deflector Shield out, the Scorpio is a great shotgun to go with. I'll let you read the talent for yourself, but it is just a great way to be able to stun lock your enemies when you need to get out of a tight corner. And then again, working under the premise that you're really only going to be using the D50 on this build. For those rare times where you're not going to be using it and you might need a little extra armor, we've gone with the Bop here for the plus 10% armor on kill secondary attribute. But overall, both your primary and secondary weapons here can entirely be up to you, as for the most part you're only going to be using the D50, crucially with the Sadist talent, which deals an additional 20% weapon damage to bleeding enemies, and after 4 enemies it applies bleed to the next enemy you hit. But that second paragraph goes largely unused, as you obviously have the RIDGEWAY'S Pride Bleeding Edge talent applying bleed constantly. I will go ahead and take this moment to talk about a couple of variations on your sidearm, not something we ordinarily do, but given how sidearm focused this build is, I want to offer 2 alternatives to the normal D50. One is the TDI card custom, which obviously has the +1 skill tier down there that will help buff your skills, and specifically your shield's health and damage. Obviously you will still want to keep the Sadist talent on there, as it will give you that 20% damage increase to bleeding enemies. But the other variation that I wanted to bring up here is the Survivalist D50, because I'm sure it will come to a lot of people's minds when they see this build, where we're recommending a D50 with Sadist on it. And of course the Survivalist D50 comes with Perfect Sadist already equipped, which deals plus 25% weapon damage to bleeding enemies, and after only 3 kills, applies bleed to the next enemy you hit. On top of that, it sports the damage to target out of cover attribute, which is really great to have just in general. But the reason why I'm not starting off with this recommendation is for one main reason, and that's, you can read there, the core attribute is capped at 11.6% weapon damage, because of a lot of weird and wacky development reasons that aren't really worth going into here, but just know that, at least for me, core attribute weapon damage is capped at 11.6%, which is obviously 4.4% lower than the normal max for a level 40 pistol, which is 15%. So while technically the math works out in the Survivalist D50's favor, as you're losing 4.4%, but you're gaining 5% from the perfect version of Sadist, the downside here is you're obviously locked into the Survivalist specialization, which doesn't really grant you anything specific for this build, and obviously you're losing the additional skill tier provided by the Technician. And on top of that, the other half of the Perfect Sadist talent is also being wasted, as we previously mentioned. The fact that after now 3 kills you apply bleed to the next enemy isn't particularly relevant, given that you're already going to be applying bleed so often with the Bleeding Edge chest talent. So for those reasons, I would recommend a normal D50 with Sadist rolled onto it, but I did want to obviously bring up the Survivalist D50, particularly if you don't have a D50 that you can roll Sadist onto. The Survivalist D50 could be a great way to try out this build, but ultimately wouldn't be what I would recommend in the long run. With that out of the way, let's get into our mask, where we've gone with the Punch Drunk named Douglas and Harding mask, which comes with plus 20% pistol damage as a brand bonus. And then on top of that, we have 15% weapon damage as the core attribute, 20% headshot damage as the unique named attribute, and we've rolled skill damage in our secondary attribute slot there to buff our overall Deflector Shield skill damage. And that is something to note here, given that it's a shield, you wouldn't necessarily think of it as an offensive talent, but the Deflector Shield specifically does get a damage boost from skill damage attributes, which is why you'll see them rolled throughout these gear pieces on this build. And then on top of that, keeping with the headshot damage theme, we've gone with headshot damage in our mod slot. This is something of a preferential pick, but I just wanted to try and boost our overall weapon damage as much as we could. And given that it is a pistol build and you're going to be very up close and personal with your enemies, grabbing those headshots is not too difficult to do and really does help increase your lethality on this build. For our backpack, we have the named Lavoisier, which is the named backpack from the Electrique brand set. First off, we get plus 10% status effects, which will help boost the bleeding edge effectiveness. And then we have attributes of skill damage, status effects, and headshot damage in the mod slot there. Throughout this build, you're going to see a combination of those 3 attributes. I would just recommend getting as much as possible of those 3 on this build to make it as effective as possible. And then of course for the talent, we have Perfect Galvanize. Applying a blind, ensnare, confuse, or shock status effect to an enemy grants 50% of your armor as bonus armor to both you and your allies within 30 meters of that enemy for 10 seconds. So given that you're going to be within 15 meters of an enemy to maintain the bleeding edge talent, what this means is anytime you apply one of those status effects, you're almost guaranteed to proc bonus armor. And particularly, I want to highlight the ensnare status effect there, as you can see in our skills, we have the Riot Foam Chem Launcher equipped, which applies the ensnare status effect. So think of this talent as just a great way to buff your armor periodically during an encounter whenever you need it, which will help keep you upright and firing. For a chest piece, we have the aforementioned RIDGEWAY'S Pride, which automatically comes with a weapon damage core, critical hit chance, and critical hit damage. And keeping with the theme, we have headshot damage there in the mod slot. But the most important thing here is obviously the bleeding edge talent. Shooting enemies within 15 meters applies bleed to the target. From there, you repair 3 to 48% of your armor per second for every enemy that is bleeding within 15 meters, and the repair strength is dependent on the number of enemies bleeding, with the repair effect doubling for every enemy bleeding up to a maximum of 48% repair. So part of why this build works so well is because it allows you to run into a group of enemies, use your shield to keep yourself upright, as well as that with the deflector component of the shield, you can now use that to also apply bleed to your enemies, which will in turn increase the repair strength being applied to you every single second, allowing you to just roll through waves of enemies and use that Riot Foam Chem Launcher to proc Galvanize, giving yourself a bonus armor when you're feeling a little vulnerable. For our gloves, we have 1 piece of Empress International giving us plus 10% skill health, which in turn increases our shield's overall health. In addition to that, we have a skill tier core, skill damage, and headshot damage in the secondary attribute slots. For our holster, we have Claws Out, which is the named Wyvern Wear holster. The brand bonus here is plus 10% skill damage. The core attribute is a skill tier. And then down there, we have 2 unique attributes for this piece that's 500% melee damage and 9% pistol damage. The primary reason we have this on here is for that 9% pistol damage, but the melee damage isn't a bad bonus either, as given how close you're going to be to enemies, you will have the opportunity to melee them when their health is low and you need to take care of them if you need to reload. For knee pads, we have 1 piece of Golan gear, which has the brand bonus of status effects as well. On top of that, we're getting a core attribute of armor, which obviously increases our overall armor, but also gives us another shield tier here, bringing us up to a grand total of 5 for this build. On top of that, we have headshot damage and status effects in our attribute slots. Obviously, if you would prefer, you could roll that to skill damage if you'd rather your shield do the damage for you. But for my money, I just wanted a little bit more headshot damage on there to make that pistol even more effective than it already is. We've already mentioned both of them a little bit before. Skills, we have the Riot Foam Chem Launcher and the Deflector Ballistic Shield. We'll talk about the less crucial one first. The Riot Foam Chem Launcher here is a great way to apply Ensnare on demand, which obviously procs the perfect Galvanize talent that we have on our backpack. On top of that, it's just a great way to stun lock enemies and give you more time to take them down without them firing back at you. But obviously, given that having them fire at you and then deflect those bullets onto themselves is a key component of this build, I would say that the Riot Foam is definitely used more situationally, whether it be to stun lock a harder enemy in place while you deal with the weaker ones, or if you just need to use it for crowd control during those moments where you're feeling overwhelmed. that would be how I recommend using the Riot Foam Chem Launcher here. Just think of it as a way to apply the galvanized talent on demand, and then secondarily you can use it as crowd control whenever you need to. But on to the main party piece of this build here, we have the Deflector Ballistic Shield. The Deflector Shield causes incoming bullets to ricochet at nearby highlighted targets with clear line of sight to the agent. Though it's not a full body shield, the lack of a brace means that only a sidearm may be used alongside this shield. And obviously shield skill tiers increase with both armor and skill tier core attributes. So if you count them up on this build, we have 5 core attributes that meet that requirement, giving us a tier 5 shield with over 7 million hit points and an average damage of over 200,000. On top of that, when you couple the Deflector Ballistic Shield with the Bleeding Edge chest talent, enemy bullets that ricochet off of your shield onto a nearby highlighted target do count for the Bleeding Edge talent. So it is a great cost-effective way to apply bleed to multiple enemies without even firing a single shot. With that all being said, I found this to be a fun and unique take on the Deflector Ballistic Shield and Bleeding Edge talent combination. I hope you think so too. As always, like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this, and tell your friends about the channel so you can continue to help us grow and make videos like this. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.
Enemy ballistic shields are up!
Move it! Targeting enemy. What the? This kid is all over me!
Hostile is here.
Think you can just take our stuff? I'm right here! Got one of those shields!
Incoming hostile.
Going down! Out of ammo again? They're coming around! How's it feel to die?
Detecting additional hostile contacts.